Greetings, this is Griff Ruby, the Nostalgic Catholic, with yet another Isaac Asimov short story. And in this case, it actually gets called out on the cover, the name of the story, and that it's by Isaac Asimov. It even has a page number, which is therefore makes its listing in the table of contents, though present, quite redundant. So, we're on page 44, and Isaac Asimov is writing about the dream. Now, there's a little squib here. The dream. Benjamin Franklin's dreams of a nation of free men were vital to the birth of the United States. The ghost of Franklin learns that some of his dreams came true, some are still hopes, and he tells about a vision of an American bicentennial. So, it comes with some rather interesting artwork. This picture here, obviously Benjamin Franklin in the background, and in the foreground, the dreamer. That is, in fact, an extreme close-up of Isaac Asimov sleeping. So that's really kind of something here. We'll have a couple more pieces of artwork. This original publication of this story. Another one where, again, he is sleeping, and you can see kind of faintly in the window the ghost of Benjamin Franklin there again, and there's Asimov sleeping. This was when he was in his bachelor apartments after he had been separated from his wife, but before he decides to move in with his what would come to be his second wife. So, yeah, I know that's. And then here's one more picture. Now he's laying there, kind of awake. These pictures, let's see. The first did not have a caption. The second actually has a caption that says, "The author sleeps as Benjamin Franklin appears to him in a dream. In a mood of phantasmagorical daring, photographer Barry Kaplan, creator of this trio of photographic studies, used author Isaac Asimov as the model for himself." And then the third one also had it was in the morning light of his New York City studio, Isaac Asimov's dream fades as he watches Franklin's figure grow dimmer, wraith-like, and then vanish in the mist. If it were a dream, it was Franklin's dream, too. So, the basic concept is fairly straightforward. It is the first day of 1790, or maybe the last day of 1789, and for Benjamin Franklin. And he is having a dream where somehow he's able to reach forward and have a conversation with somebody coming up to the brink of the American bicentennial. Now, the story is actually written in late 1973, and so bicentennial is in fact still a few years away. Isaac Asimov does have a few interesting ideas for all of this, but before we get to those, let's go to this conversation. It's kind of interesting to have Benjamin Franklin asking, so what has happened? The nation you started, it's grown, it's become very important, it's far surpassed England and France for sheer military power and everything else, though they're still doing well, but Canada is still kind of with the British. I mean, they had the British Queen on their coins at least. They're part of the Commonwealth, but they run their own affairs. So it takes a little bit of introducing each other, and how it kind of feels. They can kind of be inside each other's heads a little bit, but still have a conversation to speak of. So he credits Asimov credits Benjamin Franklin with the first electrical invention. I'm not sure, but I think that the lightning rod is in fact patent number 1 by the patent office. And so that would be interesting if that's true. I think it is. And so it's kind of appropriate that it would be started off by somebody of such a mind. And it is the first invention that at least in some way enabled humans to in some way control that mighty force of electricity, in particular that part of it where it comes down to the ground in the form of lightning and it would be nice to have it where it doesn't hit the building and destroy the building. So that is actually it's a good, useful invention. We still use it today, by the way, although I'm sure the patent is long since expired as a patent, but it's kind of interesting to see how that works. But he's saying that's not my greatest invention, not at all. My greatest invention is the United States. So it's kind of funny as he talks about his presence at some of these things. He says, well, you are a member of the committee that wrote the Declaration of Independence. Well, Tom Jefferson did the writing, though I suggested a passage or two. And you remember the Constitutional Convention? Well, I devoted myself to quieting tempers. None of that. I invented the United States over a score of years before it was born. Have they forgotten that in your time? And well, there was other things going on with the French, and the French wanted to take over Ohio Valley. I didn't know that myself, so that's kind of interesting to learn some of these things. Wolfe and the capture of Quebec. Victories in 1759 and even 1754. The French were at the Port Duquesne, only 250 miles from Philadelphia. Young George Washington's mission, for he was a young George then, a lad of 21, to the French had failed, but the colonies would not take action against the menace. The Pennsylvania proprietary government was torpid. The British were concerned with Europe, not with us. And even the Iroquois, our old Indian allies, were threatening to transfer their friendship to the French. I think at some point they would, but we could stave that off for a while at the time. So it starts with Governor Delancey of New York called the Congress of the Colonies to meet and confer about the common danger. So there's a lot of these beginnings of the country and so forth. These colonies had to unite. They had to come together. They were different for various reasons, but they had to put all that aside because of the shared political concern that all these foreign powers would have liked to pick all these different colonies off one by one and eventually absorb them all. And they saw this coming. So at some point they had to try to pull together, had to find some way to exist as states, distinct states. He doesn't mention this here, but the whole Articles of Confederation are another stage to all that. A first pass, a very crude one, and in the end not a terribly effective one for a constitution. And then basically, in a sense, the country redefined itself, with the constitution that we know of, or at least in its original form. And so he talks a little bit about how things have changed. This technology, the speed of light is 186,282 miles per second. But there's still some divisions here and there. There's a passing mention of the division between the states, the Civil War, and that gets picked up later on. Franklin says, wait a minute, you mentioned that there was this. Yeah, tell me about it. But before that, it's just one more thing said. Is there not ignorance? Is there not misery? Is there not hunger, disease, and hatred and bigotry? Bigotry is certainly a legitimate concern. I'm wondering if Benjamin Franklin, though, would have thought about that in his day. Because I'm not sure there was a very real consciousness of that as a concept. But at any rate, okay. Disorder and crime, certainly all those things are known. Has your world changed so much that these things do not exist? Oh, no, we have them. Not all of man's material advances ended the threat of those things you mentioned. We multiplied nearly 4 billion, as he writes that back then. And mankind didn't combine against that immaterial foe of all these things that could threaten. No more than the colonies combined against France or even against Great Britain until the bloodshed in New England brought them clear and present danger. That's a good phrase, clear and present danger. So Franklin said, can you wait for a clear and present danger? What you call a nuclear war would make it too late at once. If matters advanced to the point where your complex society broke down, then even in the absence of war, you could not prevent catastrophe. So he was kind of looking how things were. And great adventure in which the world is engaged in your time. There is nothing so grand that in all the nations we find common goal. Well, okay. Okay, he brought up the Civil War. Alright, let's check out this quote here. You spoke of a war between the states. Are the states still at enmity? Is the nation still divided? No, the wounds are healed. How? In what manner? That is not easy to explain. For one thing, in the years after the war, the nation was engaged in building the West. In this great colonizing venture, all the states, North and South, combined in that common task, and in the further common task of strengthening the nation, smaller enmities were forgotten. That's an interesting snapshot of how things were. I mean, the nation had pretty much pulled together. You still had some things. You still had, I don't know. I mean, the North had kind of moved on pretty much, and most of the South had too. But you still had some lost causers. It's mind-boggling to realize that even as this story is being written, the famous carving at Stone Mountain is just in that general time frame on the brink of being completed after money had been raised for it back in 1925. So it took a long time to buy it, buy the property, turn it into an area, and get the same guy that carved the faces on Mount Rushmore also carved this whole drawing of General Lee and somebody else on horses, and it's a pretty fabulous piece of art. Now I fear for its future after all these years of development and everything, and it is, in any event, a piece of art, even if one does not care for the subject matter, and I can understand that too. I mean, it was a subject matter that it's kind of a shame that such artistry is wasted on such a thing. But I don't know, somehow the destruction of artistry always just rubs me the wrong way, even when it's something that isn't worthy of the artistry that was poured into it. So, anyway, so now do they have something else to do instead of the West? That's really kind of an introduction or like a foreshadowing of what he's about to talk about. There was a lot of other things that went on between the whole North and the South thing. Lincoln wanted to try to do something peaceable, to say, let's put all our guns down, let's try to serve as one country and help each other out. Well, he wasn't around long enough to see much of that happen, and after him, the whole, what did they call that? Recovery, restoration, whatever they call that, where it's like in the South, a lot of things went astray in a lot of different ways, and what probably could have been solved in 5 to 10 years ended up extending for almost the whole rest of the 19th century, and even left things that carried well into the 20th. So it was still bad. So at any rate, but he wanted to find a foreshadowing of the idea that, well, they worked together to colonize the West. Well, that may have been one small factor in all of that. That's pointing to how we have rival powers today, and we are working together to colonize space, or at least explore it. Both ourselves and Soviet Union, which used to be the Russian Empire, sent out exploring vessels as far as planets Mars and Jupiter. That have been sent to Jupiter and haven't got there yet. As we get to the next article, that little detail gets a little more interesting. So, for a moment, with men on board, oh no, unmanned, but 6 vessels carrying 3 men each have traveled to the moon. 12 Americans have walked on the moon. A 7th vessel miscarried but brought its crew back safely to Earth. You could mention 2 other times that we went to the moon without actually landing or walking on the moon. I mean, the Apollos 8 and 10 went to the moon, but they didn't land. They weren't supposed to, so that was okay. And 13, of course, had gone there and things went very wrong, and it was a very extraordinary amount of luck and effort that they were able to make it back alive. You know, all beautifully portrayed in the Apollo 13 movie, starring Tom Hanks and so forth. But that's another ball of worms here. But you got the 6 that actually landed, to say nothing of a couple others that didn't leave Earth orbit, and one where it was a disaster. They burned on the ground, Apollo 1. So you got a lot of different things that happened. So majestic a feat at the disposal of mankind, but the nations of the world yet quarrel. So they talk about the value of satellites, which is pretty cool. And still the nations quarreled, yes. So Franklin's kind of, well, there must be further dramatization. These vessels, they go to the moon. They're only American only, or other nations? American, yeah. Strictly American. Or at least pretty much American. Bicentennial approaches. Can't the United States establish a birthday party that would be the greatest party of all time by making it a celebration for mankind? I believe for all of mankind is what he meant here. Well, if we had any aliens invade us, it would be like Shades of Independence Day movie. But we didn't go there. Launch one of your vessels, or if there's not time, announce one to be launched by the united aid of all the nations of the world. Let there be a celebration of the fourth, not as a bicentennial of a single nation, but as a glorification of the principle of the union of political entities against a common foe and for a common purpose. Now, that, interestingly enough, we did kind of do about a year early, because in 1975, in July, mind you, although a little later than the 4th, we at least managed to team up with our friends across the Iron Curtain in Russia, at the time Soviet Union, and we had the Apollo-Soyuz project, where the two craft, the two nations, long rivals in space, actually cooperated in this particular venture, which was to test a docking module that enables the Apollo module to dock with a Soyuz module. Well, unfortunately, it was a neat project just to show we could do it, but it was useless because that would in fact be the very last Apollo module ever launched into space. The Skylab had already been and gone, all the moon launchings had gone, and so forth. That was the last Apollo to fly. Soyuz, however, would go on for a great many years, but there's nothing for the other half of that docking module to meet up with. So it's just somewhere as one more orbiting object around the Earth until such time as it comes down into the atmosphere. But it was a neat thing. It was mostly symbolic. I also like the little cool aspect that Deke Slayton, the last of the Mercury astronauts, finally made it into space, so that at least all 7 of them did make it at least as far as Earth orbit at some point. So, I mean, Alan Shepard, he went on the first Mercury, but it was suborbital. But he did get to Earth orbit before doing translunar injection and going to the moon on Apollo 14 and walking there. Gus Grissom also was on the second Mercury flight, which was also suborbital, but he did make it to Earth orbit on a Gemini before being among the astronauts dying in the Apollo 1 fire. So that's not a happy life, but at least he did make it to orbit at one point. So, and then of course Deke Slayton had a health issue that kept him out of the loop for the longest time, but he finally got to orbit on the Apollo-Soyuz. The rest all flew on Mercury into orbit on Mercury capsules. John Glenn and Scott Carpenter and Walter Schirra and Gordon Cooper. They all the Mercury 7 made it at least to Earth orbit, but Deke Slayton was the last. So I don't know, nice little footnote that I thought kind of personally I was kind of like all of the space exploration stuff. So they wanted to have all of that. Problems of mankind remain. The American Union didn't solve all problems for Americans. Now this is the one place where this almost sounds like something I really believe he could have said if he managed to appear like this and have a conversation with somebody from the future. He's talking about that. He said, the American Union did not solve all problems for Americans, but it made possible for solutions to be sought and sometimes found. And then he disappeared. Oh, well. And let me just talk on that a little bit, and then there's one more bit. What's so great is that it is the Constitution itself. As originally promulgated, though it has a lot to recommend it, it was in some ways, nevertheless, a flawed document. Nowhere near so flawed as the Articles of Confederation, mind you, but it was still a somewhat flawed document. It's amazing what a tremendous oversight that it didn't have the Bill of Rights. Now, that's the very next thing, comes very shortly thereafter, but the Constitution, which is already there, is this one thing that this defines our nation, and the Bill of Rights didn't even exist yet. I mean, even the Magna Carta, England had some of that stuff clear back to the 1200s, I think. So we needed something like that too. Unfortunately, in a reasonably prompt manner, we came up with that. And of course, Bill of Rights was nothing more than the first 10 amendments, or changes, if you will, to the Constitution. And every amendment is, in effect, a change to the Constitution. And that was part of the beauty of the thing. It has a mechanism not for wild, rampant changes that can corrupt it or destroy it, but for slow, incremental change, carefully considered, and requiring a significant consensus of America to allow for small fixes here and there as a clear and present need arises for them. And that makes it a very, very powerfully honed document. And that's probably its greatest strength, is not everything in its original conception, but that part of that original conception was in its ability to be amended, to be repaired, to compensate for certain oversights and other things and other small details that didn't work out. Even just such small things as the president and vice president were competed completely separately and could potentially, and actually at some point were, of competing parties, which, you think about it this way, the vice president could organize something like a coup by killing off the president as long as he doesn't get caught, and suddenly, you just change the way this country's going by assassination. That's one thing they had to change, so that basically the two always run together as a package deal, for better or worse. but I think on the whole, that's a good thing, even if sometimes we kind of wish it could be different. But really, we know that overall that is the best way. That was an increase, an actual repair of an oversight. Things in the Bill of Rights. It's mind-boggling to think how many rights we take for granted weren't even explicit in the Bill of Rights, and other amendments would have to come along later to make it clear. Going back to the Declaration of Independence, all men are created by God and endowed by their Creator, with the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and so forth. And everybody has these things by all natural justice. I mean, it's not quite divine revelation. Divine revelation would be flawless and perfect from the get-go. But as a human effort, it had a lot going for it. And so I think that a lot of the American documents are really something special. And I think they're definitely worth, fighting to preserve. So now he makes one last interesting reference at the very end. He says, "What could I do? I don't make policy, but I am a writer. With help, I might make myself heard. With help. So I picked up the telephone and called a certain editor for, in addition to the lightning rod to the United States, Benjamin Franklin had also invented the Saturday Evening Post." In a manner of speaking, he made these printing presses, and he actually was printing a different zine called the Pennsylvania Gazette. However, starting in about 1824, he did allow somebody else, a friend of his, I'm assuming, close friend, to develop his own paper that really was the Saturday Evening Post. It was more like a newspaper than a magazine then. In time, it would become the magazine as we know it, in more recent times. So there really was a Saturday Evening Post in his time and printed on his presses. So that is kind of interesting, a nice little historical tidbit. And so that's kind of really neat, Americana. I mean, what did we end up doing? As we know, as I mentioned, Apollo Soyuz took place actually a year before. We had special coins. Again, issued both the previous year, 75, and the bicentennial year itself, 1976. I remember there was a series of novelizations of early American history of the country and its struggle to come into existence by some guy named John Jakes, I think was his name. And it was like a bicentennial series of books, portraying scenarios from the Revolution and other early times in the founding of this country. And I haven't read them, but they were very well known and popular, and now they're so forgotten. It's like you want to really plant yourself in what it was to be at the bicentennial of this great country. That would be kind of like a nice snapshot of the moments. The July the 4th celebrations were maybe a bit larger than usual, but on the whole, they tended to be pretty large anyway. So I wouldn't say there was a hugely discernible difference in that. Still, it was the bicentennial was an interesting time, and Isaac Asimov used its occasion, albeit some time before. We're talking late 1973 thereabouts, to write about it, to write about Benjamin Franklin. Apparently had written a book about Benjamin Franklin, and so he's drawing from that. And he would do this, and plus a few more stories. It actually is a small series. So I think that finishes that out. Thanks for listening.